Hi there. Now I will be covering the Saudi-Iranian Proxy War. A lot of Iran's and Saudi Arabia's neighbors are locked in a civil conflict, but in all cases, both the Iranian regime and the Saudi regime have gotten involved in those conflicts, and this is fueling some of the conflicts that are taking place in the Middle East. So I think it's very important that we investigate this matter. A good starting point might be the Islamic revival, or Tajdid or Sahwa, also as Shahwa-i-Islamiyya, or an Islamic awakening. It refers to a revival of the Islamic religion. Revivals, Tajdid, have traditionally been a periodic occurrence throughout the Islamic world, led by a quote-unquote reviver or mujaddid, who arrives at the beginning of every Islamic century, according to one hadith. The mujaddid will fear no one but God and will put a stop to religious ignorance, false innovations, and a deterioration in following of the Sunnah. The late 70s saw an Islamic revival that could be argued is still going on. It shows the delusion with the foreign ideologies and forms and the willingness to create an Islamic rather than a Western worldview for the contemporary era. Western ideological formulations, whether liberal, radical, capitalist or communist, are seen by many Muslims as having failed. The emphasis, therefore, has shifted from modernizing Islam to the Islamization of the modern experience. The revival has manifested in a process of conservative Islamization in Muslim societies, a greater piety and a growing adoption of Islamic culture among Muslims. In the 1970s and 80s, there were more veiled women in the streets and more Sharia in state law. One striking example of it is the increase in the attendance in the Hajj, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca, which grew from 90,000 in 1926 to 2 million in 1979. Now we look into how this Islamic revival manifested itself in Saudi Arabia in particular. The energy crisis of the 1970s, which led to the formation of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, was viewed by many Muslims, such as Saudi Prince Saud al-Faisal, as nothing less than a gift from God to the Islamic faithful, when hundreds of billions of dollars in oil money poured into the country. Saudi Arabia has been a theocratic state and a Wahhabist state from its inception. Wahhabism is a fundamentalist doctrine. Al-Qaeda represents Wahhabism in its purest form, a violent fundamentalist doctrine that rejects all non-Wahhabi Islam, especially the spiritual forms of Islam. Wahhabism is an expansionist sect intolerant of Shiite Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and Hinduism. In fact, Wahhabists seek to challenge and destroy these faiths. The Saudi Wahhabi threat must not be underestimated. It requires our grave attention. This is an excerpt from Saudi Arabia and the Rise of the Wahhabi Threat by Stephen Schwartz. The following excerpt from a video clip is very informative on Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia.
Wahhabism itself is a popular form of ultra-conservative Islam practiced by groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and actually has its roots deep into Saudi Arabia's history. It started in the mid-18th century with preacher Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who promoted a strict version of Islam that would not deviate whatsoever from Sharia law. Al-Wahhab settled in a part of the Middle East called Duraya, the home of the original family of Saud, and partnered with the local ruler Muhammad ibn Saud to form the first Saudi Emirate. Saud took over the military and political matters, while Al-Wahhab dictated a religious authority over the state. Over the next 300 years, this partnership has held through Saudi Arabia's rapid expansion and oil prosperity. Al-Wahhab's descendants, the Al-Ashik family, are the leading religious authority, while the Saud family rules the country. This tight-knit relationship has given rise to Saudi Arabia and Wahhabism effectively being two halves of the same coin. With its enormous wealth, Saudi Arabia has worked to spread Wahhabism. Since 1962, the Saudi-funded Muslim World League has promoted the construction of Wahhabi mosques around the world, with some sources claiming as many as 1,500 mosques were built in the second half of the 20th century. In fact, it is estimated that more than $100 billion has been spent promoting Wahhabism by Saudi backers. Saudi Arabia's efforts to promote their state-sponsored religion has many worried. By its very nature, Wahhabism is an ultra-conservative form of Islam that would appeal to repressive extremist terror groups. Despite the kingdom's claims that they do not condone terrorist actions, public executions for homosexuality and some of the worst women's rights in the world all come from Saudi's Wahhabism interpretations of Islam.
So how did this Islamic revival manifest itself in Iran? It did so primarily in the Iranian Revolution, which refers to the events involving the overthrow of the Pahlavi dynasty under Muhammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who was supported by the United States, and its eventual replacement with an Islamic republic under the Grand Ayatollah Khomeini, the leader of the revolution supported by various leftist and Islamist organizations, and the student movements. A report by the CIA states, Iranian leaders, including Ayatollah Khomeini and President Bani Sadr, are ideologically committed to aiding other Islamic revolutionaries. The Iranians see their revolution as an example for other oppressed peoples and believe that their organizational and ideological techniques they developed to topple the Shah can be used by others.
1971, the Shah of Iran, a modern autocrat, shows off his country's achievements. He's used the wealth from Iran's oil to finance a high-speed drive for modernization. He's told Iranians they must put aside old-fashioned ways and become westernized. He said science and technology should prevail, not traditional religion. But 8 years later, his regime is crumbling. In January 1979, after months of strife, he heads for Tehran airport. Though the Shah claims he's leaving on holiday, everyone knows he's going into exile. And as their ruler seeks refuge abroad, in the streets of Tehran, the crowds are overjoyed. They pin their hopes on a 77-year-old exiled cleric whose priorities are the opposite to the Shah's.
There is an increased emphasis on Islam, even with nominally secular regimes in the Middle East, such as Turkey. Even though this conflict in the Middle East between Saudi Arabia and Iran is simply called the Saudi-Iranian Proxy War, Turkey is also a big actor in the conflict itself, supporting sides as well in civil wars that are happening in the surrounding countries. And it has for a long time been increasingly desecularized.
Even in Turkey, which had been thrust into modernization in the 1920s, an Islamic party campaigned to turn back many of Ataturk's reforms. In a 1995 election, they won over 20% of the votes, the largest share of any single party. Their leaders promised to put Turkey back at the center of the Islamic world.
Şu ellerinizi lütfen canlı olarak kaldırın. İşte bu yeni tarihi çalışmayı bir kere daha hakka hakim kılmak için bütün gücümüze çalışacağımıza söz vererek başlatıyoruz. Dünya İslam Birliği için, hakka hakim kılmak için, yeniden büyük ülkeyi kurmak için, Dünya İslam Birliği'ni kurmak için, yeni bir dünya kurmak için, bütün gücümüzle çalışacağımıza söz veriyoruz. Kazanız mübarek olsun.
Turkey's role is important. For example, it has supported the Army of Conquest, which includes the Al-Nusra Front, and also described as Al-Qaeda in Syria. It's a Salafist jihadist organization fighting against the Syrian government forces in the Syrian civil war, with the aim of establishing an Islamic state in the country. Turkey has also been described as a dictatorship masquerading as a democracy, especially after an attempted coup in the country, which the ruling government of Erdogan responded to with political repression.
Kasım Pasha, one of the city's oldest neighbourhoods, and they revere him.
Growing up here, Tayyip Erdogan rejected the rigid secularism of the old ruling elite that dominated Turkish politics for nearly 80 years. A huge part of his appeal is that he offers a sense of belonging to those who felt shut out of that society, the poor and the more religiously conservative. There are millions of them.
The generations that grew up under military rule believe the coup plotters tried to destroy an order that improved their lives. Aynur Alpar has 18 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild.
Of course he cares about the people. He gave food and homes to the poor. Thank God. The ones before him didn't do anything.
There is a vengeful atmosphere. This public humiliation of army conscripts is unprecedented. The targeting of enemies with fists and with security laws has only begun. These men have reason to be afraid. They exposed alleged corruption by the Erdogan government and criticise his authoritarianism. Their website was banned today.
If we say that we are afraid, it would be selfish. There are tens of journalists in prison. We need to keep publishing. We are abused online. They can target us on the streets with guns and knives. They are capable of lynching.
The momentum is with President Erdogan now. Power is flowing to him. And in this new Turkey, you are his supporter or you are his enemy. Fergal Keane, BBC News, Istanbul.
And now we're finally going to talk about Syria. When talking about any of these countries, it is important to look into whether or not they are Sunni majority or Shia majority. In the case of Syria, the majority of the populace is Sunni. However, it is governed by a minority Alawite government, which is an offshoot of Shia Islam. Syria is a one-party state ruled by the Ba'athist Party. The Ba'athist Party is actually and quite literally modeled after the Nazi Party. Hafez al-Assad came to power in a coup, and he threw out some of the Christian elements in the government, so now the government is overwhelmingly supported by and headed by Alawites, which are quite frankly considered heretical by the fundamentalist Sunni groups in the country. The regime is now headed by Hafez al-Assad's son, Bashar al-Assad. Syria, like many dictatorships in the Middle East, was not left untouched by the Arab Spring, which seems to have turned into the Arab nuclear winter. Protests erupted, but they were quickly met with military force, and the whole situation escalated into a civil war.
But how did it all start? The uprising has its roots in the southern Syrian city of Daraa, where protests erupted in March 2011. Security forces reportedly opened fire on demonstrators, killing several. Footage filmed on mobile phones, allegedly by people on the ground, emerged online. At this stage, impossible to verify, but the only way Western media got to see what was happening inside Syria. As those who had lost loved ones buried their dead in Daraa, anti-Assad demonstrations broke out in other towns and cities. The government quickly turned to military force to crush the protests, deploying more and more tanks, troops and artillery over the following months. All of a sudden, it was less like public unrest and more like civil war. By early 2012, the fighting had reached the capital Damascus in the south and other large cities like Aleppo in the north. rebel forces advanced, but government troops continued to fight back, using overwhelming force to bombard areas they didn't control. The devastation was clear in Homs, levelled not long after Assad had audaciously addressed a crowd of his supporters, assuring them of victory.
Saudi Arabia has involved itself heavily in the Syrian civil war. Amongst other things, it has financed the purchases of weapons over growing fears of Iranian influence in Syria. This is covered by this article in the New York Times. Saudi step up help for rebels in Syria with Croatian arms, by Chivers and Smith. Saudi Arabia financed a large purchase of infantry weapons from Croatia. It has quietly funneled them to anti-government fighters in Syria, in a drive to break the bloody stalemate that has allowed President Bashar al-Assad to cling to power, according to American and Western officials familiar with the purchases. The weapons began reaching rebels in December 2013 via shipments shuttled through Jordan, officials said, and have been a factor in the rebels' small tactical gains this winter against the army and militias loyal to Mr. Assad. An important figure in the Saudi involvement in Syria is Prince Bandar bin Sultan Al Saud. As is stated in this New York Times article, the Saudi efforts were led by the flamboyant Prince Bandar bin Sultan, at the time the intelligence chief who directed Saudi spies to buy thousands of AK-47s and millions of rounds of ammunition in Eastern Europe for the Syrian rebels. The CIA helped arrange some of the arms purchases for the Saudis, including a large deal in Croatia in 2012. By the summer of 2012, a freewheeling field that had taken hold along Turkey's border with Syria, as the Gulf nations funneled cash and weapons to rebel groups, even some that American officials were concerned had ties with radical groups like Al-Qaeda. The CIA was mostly on the sidelines during this period, authorized by the White House under the Timber Sycamore training program to deliver non-lethal aid to the rebels but not weapons. In late 2012, according to two former senior American officials, David H. Petraeus, then CIA director, delivered a stern lecture to intelligence officials of several Gulf nations at their meeting near the Dead Sea in Jordan. He chastised them for sending arms to Syria without coordinating with one another or with the CIA officers in Jordan and Turkey. Months later, Obama gave his approval for the CIA to begin directly arming and training rebels from a base in Jordan, amending the Timber Sycamore program to allow for lethal assistance. Under a new arrangement, the CIA took the lead in training, while Saudi Arabia's intelligence agency, the General Intelligence Directorate, provided money and weapons, including TOV anti-tank missiles. It's quite possible that fighting against secularization is a secondary motive for the Saudis. Also, apparently, Saudi Arabia has sent death row inmates to fight in Syria.
And last but by no means least, you have Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Saudi Arabia is financially and politically backing the civilian opposition, and Qatar has been widely reported to be funding and arming the jihadi rebels who are leading this insurrection. Now, obviously, apart from doing NATO's dirty work, Saudi Arabia and Qatar hate the Syrian regime for a simple reason: it's secular. This is the only secular country that's left in the Middle East now. We've seen the overthrow of secular regimes throughout the region during the past year, and in their place, Islamists who are often very closely aligned with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, if not funded by them, have taken their place. And so this is the Saudi-Qatari Wahhabi revolution, and its culmination will be the overthrow of the Assad regime, the death of the final secular state in the Arab world, and it's obvious who will take their place: the radical jihadists and their counterparts in the Muslim Brotherhood.
Now to cover the Iranian involvement in the Syrian civil war. For decades, the Iranian regime has aligned itself with the Assad regime. It has channeled thousands of fighters into Syria and a lot of weapons as well. In its ongoing proxy war with Saudi Arabia, it hopes to maintain its influence within Syria. Hezbollah, which is a Lebanese militia and political party rolled into one, is aligned with Iran as well and supported by Iran, has stopped focusing on Israel and has started attacking rebels in support of President Bashar al-Assad and his regime.
At his home in Iran, a man is weighing up whether he should go and fight in a foreign conflict, along with friends who are already there. Eventually he decides to leave his children, bidding goodbye to Iran's mullahs too, who will pay him up to $600 a month to fight in far-off Syria. It's a recruitment advert, aired on Iranian state TV last year, but there's no mention of money here. Instead, an appeal to destroy Sunni jihadists, including ISIS, and defend the tomb of Zainab in Damascus, one of Shia Islam's holiest shrines. Iran has recruited an army of Shia fighters to prop up President Assad and to extend an arc of Shia influence from Tehran all the way to the Mediterranean, which has Washington and its allies rattled.
Iran provides arms, financing, and training, and funnels foreign fighters into Syria. It has also sent members of the Iran Revolutionary Guards to take part in direct combat operations.
South of Aleppo, in Syria, and the master of those operations is about to make a very rare public appearance. He's Qasim Soleimani, the commander of Iranian military missions overseas, and credited with turning the tide of Syria's war. In this adoring crowd are Iraqi, Lebanese and Afghan fighters, as well as Iranians, so he speaks to them in a mixture of Persian and Arabic, though they are all fighting under the banner of Shia Islam.
The Syrian response. Syria is in a state of civil war, and the rebel factions have received support from both Saudi Arabia, Qatar and the United States. The Assad regime is however supported by both Iran and Russia. At the beginning of the conflict, Bashar al-Assad released thousands of jihadis to tank the rebellion. Thus he made a tactical concession to further the strategic aim of discouraging the Western powers from supporting the rebellion.
And some Syrian troops even defect from the Syrian army to join them. They call themselves the Free Syrian Army, and the uprising becomes a civil war. Extremists from around the region and the world start traveling to Syria to join the rebels. Now, Assad actually encourages this by releasing jihadist prisoners to tinge the rebellion with extremism and make it harder for foreign backers to support them.
Regarding the Russian involvement in the Syrian civil war, Russia aims to maintain its naval facility in Tartus. Russia has exported large amounts of weapons to Syria. 10% of its export in some years has been to Syria alone. It has a significant deployment of military aircraft, and for a time being it also had a significant naval presence in the eastern Mediterranean.
There is plenty of evidence of the ferocity of the assault. Like so much in this broken country, Salma has paid dearly. This Syrian soldier was among those who fought back into the town. The enemy, how far away is the enemy?
After 1 kilometer.
1 kilometer.
1 kilometer.
And it is Al-Nusra front?
Yes, Daesh and Nusra.
Daesh and Al-Nusra.
Yes.
And they were here?
Yes.
How many?
I live here 5 years.
This Russian general says the rebel occupation was more like 3 years. But whatever the truth, Salma was a rebel stronghold that has been in Russian sights since its entry into the war last year. Russian aircraft have been pounding the rebels here since October, taking out key positions on hills surrounding the town. Moscow insists it was Syrian troops, though, that actually took Salma. But across Syria, it is Russian military hardware, both in the skies and on the seas, that has been critical in shoring up President Assad's beleaguered forces. This is the Russian missile cruiser Varyak, part of a considerable navy presence that has seen long-range guided missiles fired at rebel positions from the safety of the sea. But for all the talk of progress, the truth is that the war here remains bitterly deadlocked. Russian boots on Syrian soil might have to become a much more common sight for the dynamic of this conflict to change dramatically in President Assad's favour. Dan Rivers, News at 10, Salma, Syria.
Turkey's involvement in the Syrian civil war. Turkey aims to topple the Assad regime. It wants to prevent the formation of a Kurdish state, which has been its strategic objective for a very long time. It has also been accused of clandestine ties with ISIS. Early in the war, discussions regarding the possible invasion of Syria were leaked, so it's quite clear that Turkey is considering a full-scale military intervention. It has already launched a small operation into northern Syria aimed at protecting a tomb, and has attacked ISIS on occasion, but is mostly attacked the Kurds.
Turkey's military operation in Syria aimed at securing its border from Islamic State has come to an end. The official announcement from Ankara comes right before the U.S. Secretary of State's first official visit to the Turkish capital. RT's Lizzie Phelan has the story for us.
Now, the end of Euphrates Shield wasn't announced by Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan directly, but by Turkey's National Security Council. And the timing here is crucial. It comes just ahead of a visit by U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson to Ankara, the highest level meeting between Turkish and American officials since President Donald Trump entered the White House. And it also comes following a global anti-ISIL summit in Washington, where the US-led coalition praised Ankara's efforts in the fight against ISIL in Syria. Ankara has also been patting itself on the back lately in public statements for what they describe as the success of the Euphrates Shield operation. However, many will wonder what have come of Turkey's repeated threats against Kurdish-led forces in Syria. Ankara has said time and time again that the Euphrates Shield operation isn't just focused on ISIL, but also against US-backed Kurdish-led forces in Syria that Ankara says are worse than ISIL because of their links to Turkey's domestic Kurdish insurgency that Ankara has been at war with for decades. Now, the US support for those Kurdish forces and their decision to choose them to spearhead America's crucial battle for ISIL's de facto capital in Syria, Raqqa, despite repeated Turkish protests, is expected to be a bone of contention during Tillerson's visit to Ankara. Crucially, Ankara has said that while Euphrates Shield is over, that the Turkish army will launch a new campaign in Syria if needed under a new name, which will be read by many as a message that their fight against ISIL in Syria may be over, but not their fight against the Kurds. And
American involvement in the Syrian civil war. Obama sent weapons and provided training to rebel groups. Obama was continually frustrated with allies that didn't view ISIS as the #1 priority. The United States has only once attacked the regime of Bashar al-Assad directly. That was following alleged chemical attacks by the Syrian regime. America's efforts in the Syrian civil war have been frustrated by the fact that their key ally in the area, Turkey, has been attacking the Kurds, which the United States has been supporting in their fight against ISIS. Meanwhile, the Turkish and Saudi Arabian regimes both consider toppling Bashar al-Assad a higher priority than defeating ISIS.
The next question then is about, what this administration has done, right? We know that President Obama, he sat down with Fareed Zakaria for this extensive interview. Fareed asked him how he feels about the U.S. out of the Syrian civil war militarily. Here is what he said.
I think it is the smartest decision from a menu of bad options that were available to us. But do I believe that it would have been a profound mistake for us to wade in and to currently have 100,000 troops or 50,000 troops inside of Syria right now? Do I think that the situation would be better for us? I do not believe so.
How do Syrians feel about Obama's decision?
Well, I think they feel deeply disappointed. They also felt that they were misled. Part of the reason they went out and marched into a hail of bullets carrying signs calling for freedom was because they saw what had happened in Libya and the moral precedent that had been established there by the U.S., and they genuinely believed that the West would come in some capacity, if not to actively support them, then certainly to prevent the basically extermination that we have seen take place across the country. And I think what's a little bit disingenuous about President Obama, the statement that you just heard to Fareed there, is that essentially he's presenting this as it was either a choice to do nothing, which is the choice the U.S. went with, or it was a choice to send in 100,000 troops and have a full-on military intervention, a full-on invasion, if you like. And to people on the ground inside Syria, that feels like a false representation. They believe very firmly that the international community could have done more, that a coalition could have been established. We've heard from the Saudis and from the Turks and from the Qataris that they were willing to take on the onus of a ground presence if only they had at least the support of the U.S. As always with these situations, hindsight is 20/20. Obviously, in the fog of war, it's never easy to make these decisions, but certainly on the ground, deep, deep disappointment and bitterness about the U.S.'s lack of involvement, Brooke.